In the heart of Louisiana, on a cold Christmas Eve in 1854, a night meant for celebration turned into a nightmare of fire and blood. Behind the grand doors of a sprawling plantation mansion, where music, laughter, and the glow of candlelight promised joy, the very foundations of power were about to collapse. This is not a tale of legends or superstition, but of a woman enslaved, silenced, and forgotten, who transformed her pain into the most shocking act of resistance the South had ever seen. Her name was Sarah. She lived her life in chains, yet on that night she set the world of her oppressors ablaze, leaving 9 dead and a legacy carved in fire. Tonight, we will uncover the story of Sarah's unimaginable courage, a woman who, after years of humiliation and cruelty, struck back with a fury that still echoes through history. But who was she, and what pushed her to such a brutal act on one of the holiest nights of the year? Stay with us until the end of this video to discover every hidden detail, every injustice, and every step that led Sarah from silence to vengeance. And before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments the city you're watching from. This is a history you will never forget. Her name was Sarah, though the household rarely used it. To the masters, she was simply girl, a word spoken with the sharpness of command. Among the enslaved, however, her name carried weight, a quiet respect born from her skills and resilience. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and strong from years of labor, with hands calloused by cane knives and shoulders hardened from hauling baskets through endless rows of sugar. But there was more to her than strength. She was known for her sharp mind, her ability to sew torn clothes with precision, to treat fevers with herbs gathered along the riverbank, and to calm frightened children when night terrors set in after a day of lashing. Her daily life followed the same crushing routine. Rising before dawn, tending to the fire in the kitchens, carrying water, scrubbing floors, and standing silent behind the master's chairs as they feasted. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm, her mind never rested. She noticed details others missed: the keys at the overseer's belt, the storage of oil near the barn, the moments when the household guards were drunk with rum. These small observations, insignificant to others, settled deep inside her memory, waiting for the day they might serve a purpose. Within the quarters, Sarah was both admired and pitied. The elders whispered that she carried a rare steadiness, that she never flinched in front of the whip, that her eyes stayed fixed even when insult fell on her name. Younger women sought her advice, especially those who feared the unwanted attentions of their masters. Children clung to her, knowing she would shield them from blows when she could. To them, Sarah was more than a fellow captive. She was a protector in a world that allowed no mercy. But this respect came at a cost. The slaveholders themselves, sensing her strength, treated her with a sharpened cruelty. The mistress of the house despised Sarah's composure, often inventing reasons to punish her. A dish not polished to a shine, a glance considered too long, a silence misinterpreted as defiance. The master, meanwhile, saw in her endurance a challenge, one that he believed could be broken with enough force. Time and again, they tried to crush her spirit, and time and again, Sarah endured. In this contradiction, honored within her own community, despised by those who ruled it, Sarah lived each day balancing two truths. On the surface, she was a servant, expected to bow, to obey, to remain invisible. But beneath that mask, she carried an unspoken fire, a clarity that her life was more than bondage, that her body and soul did not belong to those who claimed them. And while no one yet knew it, Sarah had already begun to imagine a night when fear would no longer chain her steps. Sarah's strength had not been born in peace, it had been forged in suffering. Long before the events of that Christmas Eve, she had endured a trauma so profound that it reshaped her very existence. She had once been a young mother, cradling a child she believed might grow to know something better than chains. The infant was frail but full of promise, with dark eyes that mirrored her own. For a brief moment in her harsh life, Sarah had allowed herself to dream that perhaps, if she worked quietly, obeyed, and avoided the overseer's wrath, her child might survive the cruel machinery of the plantation system. That dream was shattered in a single night of unrelenting violence. The master's eldest son, drunk on whiskey and arrogance, had demanded Sarah serve at a Christmas gathering. She had resisted only with silence, but resistance, however small, was seen as rebellion. When he struck her, the baby in her arms tumbled to the ground. The infant's cries rose into the winter air but fell silent too quickly. The boy laughed, dismissing the moment as if it were nothing more than spilled wine, while Sarah's screams echoed through the house. Her child, not yet 2 months old, never drew another breath. The masters did not speak of it. To them, it was a small inconvenience, a woman's grief worth less than the price of a barrel of sugar. No punishment was given, no apology offered. Instead, Sarah was whipped the following morning for failing to fulfill her duty. The scars on her back healed slowly, but the wound carved inside her never closed. From that day forward, her silence became a mask, her eyes a fortress that hid the storm within. Among the enslaved community, whispers of her loss traveled like fire in dry cane. Some wept with her, others kept their distance, knowing that grief often drew the overseer's attention. Yet all saw the transformation. The woman who once hummed lullabies as she worked became a figure of quiet determination. Her back straightened when she carried water, her jaw set when insults rained down. The pain she carried did not diminish, it sharpened into resolve. That night of loss became her founding trauma, the moment that planted the seed of vengeance deep in her soul. Sarah did not speak of revenge aloud. She never needed to. The memory of her child's lifeless body was enough to remind her every hour that there would be no justice unless she carved it with her own hands. And so, as seasons turned and years passed, Sarah carried her grief like a hidden blade, close, silent, and ready. The masters saw only a servant they believed was broken, but within her chest she had already made a promise. Someday they would pay. The years that followed only deepened Sarah's scars. The plantation thrived, its wealth growing on the backs of the enslaved, while hunger and brutality spread like a sickness among those who toiled in the cane fields. Every harvest season, men collapsed under the sun, their bodies broken by endless cutting and hauling. Women were forced to serve not only in the fields, but also in the bedrooms of their owners, their dignity stripped away with every passing night. Children, barely strong enough to carry buckets of water, were pushed into labor before they could even form full sentences. For Sarah, these images carved themselves into her memory like marks on stone. She watched her friends and kin wither, their lives shortened by exhaustion and cruelty. She saw whippings carried out for the smallest of mistakes, an overturned pail of water, a cough mistaken for laziness, a glance considered disrespectful. Punishments were not just physical, but also psychological. Families torn apart at the auction block, husbands sent miles away to other plantations, mothers screaming as their children were sold like livestock. The household itself became more oppressive when the master's younger brother arrived from New Orleans to modernize the estate. With him came new ideas about efficiency and discipline. He increased quotas, demanded longer hours, and introduced harsher rules. The overseer, already feared, now carried a new kind of cruelty in his step, eager to prove his loyalty to this new authority. The once grueling days became unbearable, every breath underlined with the threat of pain. Sarah's position in the household placed her close enough to see the hypocrisy. She carried trays of food into rooms filled with laughter and indulgence, where the masters dined on roasted meats and imported wine, while the enslaved chewed on scraps, sometimes gnawed bones discarded from the table. She cleaned the halls decorated with imported carpets, knowing her own quarters leaked rainwater through broken roofs. She watched silk dresses sweep across the floor, while the women in the cabins patched together rags to shield themselves from the cold. Each day, her hatred grew heavier, like a chain that no longer dragged her down but instead pulled her forward. She saw the arrogance of her oppressors, blind to the humanity of those who served them, and she understood something dangerous. They believed they were untouchable. Their confidence was their greatest weakness. Sarah did not yet act, but she learned. She measured the distance from the kitchen to the barn. She noted the way lanterns flickered in the hallways, the moments when guards stumbled into sleep, the places where shadows were thickest at night. Every insult, every blow, every humiliation fed her determination. She knew that to survive was no longer enough. The fire inside her demanded more. And so, beneath the mask of obedience, Sarah's resolve hardened. The plantation's cruelty had given her grief, but now it gave her clarity. There would come a day when the whip cracked for the last time. By the winter of 1854, Sarah had lived more than a decade under the shadow of cruelty, but it was one particular night that pushed her beyond the threshold of endurance. The household was preparing for the Christmas celebrations, a season when the masters drank heavily, flaunted their wealth, and expected the enslaved to serve not only with obedience but also with forced cheer. The house glittered with candles and wreaths of pine, while the cabins remained dark, the smell of boiled corn the only sign of a meal. In the weeks leading up to the celebration, the punishments had grown harsher. The overseer, emboldened by his new authority, had whipped a boy of 12 nearly unconscious for failing to carry a sack of cane fast enough. Sarah had rushed forward to shield the child, earning herself a lash across the face that left a scar stretching from cheek to jaw. That scar, still burning days later, became a visible reminder that there was no mercy here, only domination. But the true breaking point came when the mistress of the house turned her cruelty on Sarah directly. Accusing her of moving too slowly with a tray of wine, the woman struck Sarah with the heavy silver goblet in front of guests. Blood spilled across the polished floor, and laughter followed, not from the enslaved, but from the young masters, drunk and amused by the spectacle. Sarah stood silent, her jaw tight, while the mistress ordered her back to work, warning that another mistake would send her to the fields in chains. That night, alone in the quarters, Sarah felt something snap. She sat on the wooden floor, her hands trembling not from fear but from clarity. The scar on her cheek, the memory of her dead child, the cries of beaten children, the laughter of men who treated her pain as entertainment, all of it converged into one unshakable truth. There would never be justice unless she created it herself. Among the enslaved, some whispered that endurance was the only path to survival. Others spoke of escape, of following the river north toward freedom. But Sarah knew her fate was tied to the soil she walked every day, to the walls of the mansion that had witnessed her suffering. Running would not silence the memory of her child, nor would it stop the cycle of cruelty that destroyed every soul within reach of that house. In that moment, she made her silent vow. Christmas Eve would not end with music and laughter for the masters. The same night they celebrated as a symbol of joy and salvation would become the night their world burned. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to feel something dangerous, hope not of survival, but of vengeance. The point of no return had come. Once the vow had been made, Sarah no longer carried her pain in silence. She carried a purpose, but to strike against a family so powerful, she could not act alone. In the weeks before Christmas, she began to move carefully, testing words, gauging trust, and seeking out those whose wounds were as deep as hers. Her first ally was Isaiah, an older man who had once been sold away from his wife and children. He worked in the stables, quiet and withdrawn, his back a map of scars. Sarah approached him late at night while he brushed down the horses. She spoke not of vengeance directly, but of dignity, of the need to end the cycle of cruelty. His eyes lifted slowly, and for the first time in years, he nodded with something more than despair. Next was Clara, a young woman often forced into the master's chambers. Her face carried a hollowness that only those who had endured such violations could know. Sarah sat beside her one evening by the river, their feet in the cold water, and whispered, "We are worth more than this." Clara's tears fell silently, but when she turned to Sarah, there was steel in her gaze. One by one, Sarah gathered them. David, strong and steady, who had lost 2 brothers to the lash. Martha, whose infant had been taken from her arms and sold to another estate. Each carried a story of humiliation and loss. Each had thought themselves powerless. But under Sarah's quiet guidance, their grief began to form into resolve. Together, they wove a plan, meeting in the shadows of the cane fields, their voices low, their eyes darting for overseers. Sarah mapped out the mansion in whispered detail. The kitchen where the oil was stored, the heavy curtains that would ignite quickly, the wooden beams that could collapse under fire. She remembered the way the masters grew careless with wine, the hours when laughter drowned out everything else. The group studied these details as if they were scripture, committing each step to memory. But more than a plan, Sarah created a bond. She told them that their act was not only for themselves, but for every child beaten, every family separated, every life reduced to labor. It was not vengeance alone, it was justice. Around a small fire hidden deep in the fields, the group placed their hands together in a circle. No words were shouted, only a silent agreement, a pact sealed by shared suffering. The night grew colder as Christmas drew near. Yet within the quarters, an invisible fire already burned. Every chore, every order, every lash of the whip no longer weighed the same. They were no longer merely enslaved. They were conspirators in a rising storm. And when the bells rang on Christmas Eve, the household would never know that those who bowed their heads in silence were the same who had already chosen to strike. Christmas Eve arrived draped in false grandeur. The mansion glowed with candlelight, its great hall filled with garlands of pine and polished silver. The masters and their guests gathered in fine clothes, their laughter spilling into the night. The smell of roasted meats and spiced wine floated through the air, while fiddles played lively tunes to drown out the world beyond the estate walls. To those who ruled, it was a night of joy and indulgence. To Sarah and her allies, it was the night of reckoning. From the shadows of the kitchen, Sarah watched them. Her scarred cheek caught the flicker of firelight as she carried trays of food and wine with the same composure she always had. No one suspected the stillness in her movements, the way her eyes lingered on the hall's heavy curtains or the candles clustered along the tables. The master's arrogance was their blindfold. They saw obedience in every bowed head, never realizing rebellion was breathing at their feet. Isaiah waited in the stables, oil hidden beneath the straw. Clara moved silently through the back halls, ensuring the doors were unlatched. David, tall and broad, carried firewood into the parlor, leaving behind small bundles of kindling wrapped in cloth soaked with lamp oil. Each ally took their place with precision, their actions masked as chores, their hearts pounding as the hours slipped closer to midnight. The moment came as the celebration swelled. The masters were drunk, their songs slurred, their laughter deafening. Sarah slipped into the hall with a tray of goblets. As she passed the long curtains, her hand brushed against the fabric, leaving behind the faint smear of oil. She placed the tray on the table, bowed her head as expected, and moved away. Behind her, Clara's hand trembled slightly as she tipped a candle too close to the curtain's edge. At first, it was nothing, a small flicker, a whisper of smoke. Then the flames leapt upward, devouring the heavy fabric with startling speed. Gasps turned to screams as the fire spread, racing across garlands, igniting the tablecloths, climbing the wooden beams of the ceiling. Panic erupted. Wine spilled, chairs overturned, and the once proud masters scrambled like frightened animals. Sarah did not retreat. She moved with purpose, her eyes fixed on the men who had scarred her life. One by one, her allies struck. David blocked the doors, shoving back those who tried to escape. Isaiah swung a heavy beam from the stables, striking down a master who lunged toward him. Clara, once powerless in the chambers of the household, now held a kitchen blade with a grip that did not falter. 9 of them fell that night, men who had believed themselves untouchable, women who had delighted in cruelty, heirs who had laughed at the suffering of others. Their cries were drowned by the roar of the flames, the music of vengeance overtaking the fiddles. Outside, the enslaved watched as the mansion burned, its glow lighting the cane fields like dawn. For the first time, they saw their oppressors brought low, their world of power reduced to ash. And at the center of it all stood Sarah, no longer the servant bowed in silence, but the flame that consumed the house of tyranny. The mansion, once a towering symbol of wealth and authority, now stood as a blazing inferno against the winter night. Flames licked the sky, sparks carried upward like shattered stars, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. What had been polished wood, velvet curtains, and crystal chandeliers only moments before became fuel for the fire. The roar of destruction drowned out the last cries of those trapped inside. For Sarah and her allies, it was not merely the collapse of walls and ceilings. It was the purification of a poisoned world. Each flame consumed more than timber. It devoured decades of humiliation, lashes, and stolen lives. The fire was justice in its rawest form, erasing the illusion of power that had been used to crush them. For the enslaved who gathered outside, the blaze reflected in their eyes was more than firelight. It was the first flicker of freedom. Sarah stood near the steps of the mansion, her face illuminated in orange and red, the scar on her cheek glowing like a brand transformed into a badge of defiance. Smoke curled around her and the heat pressed against her skin, but she did not move away. Behind her, Clara held on to Martha, whose hands shook as if trying to release years of grief all at once. Isaiah, his body trembling from exhaustion, whispered words that sounded like a prayer, not to the master's God, but to the memory of his lost family. The act was not only vengeance, it was release. The house that had witnessed their degradation no longer existed. The rooms where children had been sold, where women had been violated, where men had been broken under the lash. Those places were now nothing but ash carried away by the night wind. Sarah felt as if the very ground sighed with relief, the soil reclaiming what had been poisoned. As the fire spread outward, consuming the outbuildings and licking at the cane fields, Sarah made a final choice. She lifted a torch high above her head and cast it into the barn, where tools, wagons, and barrels of molasses waited. The explosion that followed thundered across the plantation, sending a shock of light that turned the night sky red. It was the signal, the moment when silence gave way to shouts, when fear gave way to movement. Other enslaved men and women who had watched in disbelief began to cheer, their voices rising above the crackle of the flames. Some fell to their knees, others raised their fists, and a few, emboldened by the sight, broke open the storage sheds, taking food, clothes, and tools long denied to them. The fire had unshackled more than their chains, it had unshackled their voices. By the time the mansion collapsed in on itself, sending a tower of sparks into the night sky, Sarah understood the truth. There was no turning back. The house was gone, the masters dead, and a new story had begun. It was not just the destruction of a building, but the cleansing of an era, and she, scarred and unbowed, had struck the match. The morning after the fire, the cane fields of Louisiana did not wake to the usual rhythm of overseers' whips or the hollow sound of bells calling the enslaved to labor. Instead, the sky was still streaked with smoke, the air thick with the stench of charred wood and flesh. The great mansion, once a symbol of untouchable power, had collapsed into smoldering ruin. Where polished halls had stood, there now lay blackened beams and piles of ash. Word spread quickly. From the neighboring plantations, riders brought news to the masters. The family that had ruled so mercilessly was gone, 9 dead in a single night, their house reduced to nothing. Among the enslaved communities, whispers traveled just as fast, carried from cabin to cabin, from one riverbank to another. The story took on the weight of legend almost immediately. An enslaved woman had risen, and the masters had burned. For those still in bondage, it was a spark of hope. Men who had bowed their heads for decades now raised them a little higher. Mothers told their children in hushed tones that the world could change. Sarah's name, spoken softly at first, began to grow louder, repeated with awe. She became more than a woman, she became a symbol, a reminder that courage could strike even at the heart of tyranny. But freedom and myth carried a cost. The surviving members of the plantation class, outraged and terrified, demanded vengeance. Within days, armed patrols swept the countryside. Riders in gray coats scoured the roads, hunting for those suspected of involvement. The authorities declared that the fire was not merely an act of rebellion, but an attack on the very order of the South. Repression tightened like a noose. Curfews were enforced on the enslaved, gatherings outlawed, punishments escalated. The whip cracked harder than before, as masters sought to remind those in chains that defiance would bring only suffering. Sarah and her closest allies understood the danger immediately. They could not remain near the ruins, where suspicion and fury burned as hot as the embers. Some fled into the swamps, using the thick reeds and tangled roots as cover. Others disappeared upriver, blending into the vast stretches of cane country. Rumors claimed that Sarah herself had been seen in several places at once, leading groups northward, hiding in the bayous, or vanishing into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. In the cabins, the enslaved clung to the story. They whispered of how Sarah had stood before the fire with her scar glowing like a mark of destiny, how she had struck down the masters with her own hands, how she had walked away untouched by the flames. The truth blurred with legend, but the impact was the same. She had shown that even the mighty could fall. The planters could rebuild their homes. They could buy new slaves, enforce harsher laws, and wield their power with renewed cruelty. But they could not erase what had happened that night. The memory of the burning mansion lingered like smoke in the air, impossible to contain. And so, in the wake of destruction, 2 legacies were born, one of terror enforced by the fearful masters and one of hope carried in the whispers of the enslaved. At the center of both stood Sarah, the woman who had lit the fire. The hunt for Sarah consumed the Louisiana countryside. Armed patrols combed through swamps and river crossings, their torches glowing like angry stars against the night. Rewards were posted in local towns, posters promising gold for her capture, dead or alive. Some swore they saw her silhouette vanish into the reeds. Others insisted she escaped northward with a band of runaways. The truth of her fate was never clear, and perhaps that was her greatest weapon. For weeks, slaveholders whispered among themselves in fear. If a single woman could orchestrate such destruction, what might happen if more followed her path? They tightened their grip, issuing harsher punishments, but their paranoia betrayed them. They looked over their shoulders, afraid of the very people they had once dismissed as powerless. Sarah had struck not only at their bodies, but at the fragile illusion of their invincibility. Among the enslaved, Sarah's absence did not weaken her legend, it magnified it. In the cabins, elders told children that she had not perished, but had walked into the fire and risen stronger, her scar turned to flame. Others said she had slipped into the Mississippi, carried away by the river toward freedom. Some believed she still hid in the cane fields, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. The details mattered less than the message. She had proved that resistance was possible. In time, her story spread beyond Louisiana. Traveling preachers whispered of her courage, abolitionist papers in the North retold the account with hushed reverence, and fugitives carried her name along secret routes. She became a phantom in the minds of slaveholders and a beacon in the hearts of the enslaved. Every strike of the whip, every cruel order now carried the unspoken question, what if another Sarah rises? The mansion itself was never rebuilt. Its ruins stood as a scar on the land, charred beams jutting upward like broken bones. Travelers along the river spoke of the site with unease, calling it cursed, though the enslaved knew it differently. To them, it was hallowed ground, the place where silence had ended, where one woman's grief had turned into fire, where chains had melted in the heat of defiance. Sarah's ultimate fate was swallowed by mystery. Some claimed she was captured and executed in secret, her body hidden to prevent her from becoming a martyr. Others swore they saw her years later, older but unbroken, living under another name in a distant state. What remained undeniable was the legacy she left behind. She became more than flesh and blood. She became memory, myth, and warning. Generations later, when children of the South asked why masters feared the dark of Christmas Eve, the elders would answer with her name. Sarah, the enslaved woman who burned the mansion and killed 9 on the night, the powerful thought themselves untouchable. Sarah, the fire that could not be quenched. Her story closed not with her death, but with her transformation into something larger. A symbol that justice, once ignited, cannot be extinguished.